Hey, shalom, shalom from your Dutch Uncle John, here to tell you what it is in part 2 of Esther. Okay, if you haven't watched part 1, you need to watch it. And it ended with, remember Haman, he was upset because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him, Mordecai being a Jew. And he had a gallows built 50 cubits high, and he was going to have him hanged. And he was feeling good. Queen Esther invited him to a banquet, and the king had made him number 2 in all of the kingdom. So that's where we left off in part 1, and we'll move on now to part 2. This is chapter 6, starting in verse 1. It says, "During the night the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, 'What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?' Then the king's servants who attended him said, 'Nothing has been done for him.'" Remember, this was back in like chapter 2 or 3, 2 I think. There were the 2 guys who were planning to kill the king. Mordecai overheard their plot. He told his cousin Esther, the queen. She reported to the king, and the king had them hanged, and he had the story written in the book of the Chronicles. And now it's years later, he can't sleep. He has this book read to him, and he discovers that nothing has been done to honor them. Verse 4, "So the king said, 'Who is in the court?' Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, 'Behold, Haman is standing in the court.' And the king said, 'Let him come in.' So Haman came in, and the king said to him, 'What is to be done for men whom the king desires to honor?' And Haman said to himself, 'Whom would the king desire to honor more than me?'" Verse 7, "Then Haman said to the king, 'For the man whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to the one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" So Haman thinks that the king wants to honor him. He doesn't realize he's planning on honoring Mordecai, who Haman has just built a gallows on which to hang Mordecai. This is chapter 6. This is the turning point of the whole Esther story. Verse 10, "Then the king said to Haman, 'Take quickly the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all that you have said.' So Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home mourning, with his head covered. Haman recounted to Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh his wife said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Remember, Esther invited the king and Haman to a banquet. They came to the banquet, And the king says, what do you want, Esther? And she said, I want you to come tomorrow to a banquet and bring Haman. So we got these two banquets for some reason, okay? And it's interesting, in this 6:13, Haman's wife was very perceptive. She says, if Mordecai is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. This reminds me of Matthew 16:18. It says, and I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. So whatever plan Mordecai or Haman has to destroy the Jews ain't going to happen. Chapter 7, verse 1. Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day, also as they drank their wine at the banquet, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done. Then Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king. Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who would presume to do this? Okay, so the king's asking, what do you want, Esther? And she said, I want my life spared and my people spared. And well, who would even dare to try to kill the queen and her people? That's where we are right here. And I do want to point out that in verse 5 of chapter 7, here, if you look at it in the Hebrew, every third letter there on the second line spells I am. Okay? Very nice. I am. Verse 6, Esther said, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. The king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. Look in verse 7. We got Yahweh's name is hidden again. Remember, God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, but his name now has appeared 4 times. Not to mention, it's in that name Yekoniah, which we mentioned in part 1. But here, it's mentioned Yud, He, Vav, He. It's the end letters of 4 consecutive words. If you look at all the different options we have seen, we've seen 4. We have Yahweh's name beginning 4 consecutive words. Esther 1:20, it's written backwards, beginning 4 words. In Esther 5:4, it's Yud He Vav He, it begins 4 consecutive words. And then you look at the last letters of 4 consecutive words. Esther 5:13, it has Yahweh backwards, and Esther 7:7, which we've just read, has his name forward, ending 4 consecutive words. So those are all 4 possibilities, and he's got all 4 of them hidden in this story. Very nice. Remember, Esther means something hidden, and God is hidden there. Very nice. Okay, verse 8. Now, when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbonah, one of the eunuchs who was before the king, said, behold, indeed, the gallows standing in Haman's house 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Wow, there's a turn of events. Okay, chapter 8. By the way, a gallows 50 cubits high. This is a cubit, right? From your elbow to finger. 50 cubits, that's mighty high. Almost too high. It's hard for me to fathom such a gallows. Okay, chapter 8, verse 4. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king. Then she said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, and I am pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the calamity which will befall my people, and how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred?" You know, if you go back and look throughout the book of Esther, of all the times it was mentioned or alluded to destroy and annihilate the Jews. I've gone through and done them all here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 8 verses that call for the destruction of the Jews. You can see them here. Destroy, 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 all the way through. But let's also go back through and count how many times that the Jews were instructed to fight back and destroy those who were trying to destroy them. And I have them listed here. Starting in 8:11 and going through 9:16, there are 8 verses that call for the Jews to fight back. Very nice. Verse 7. So King Ahasuerus, remember Ahasuerus is Xerxes. That's another name for him. I think that's the Greek name for him. So King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they have hanged on the gallows, because he had stretched out his hands against the Jews." Verse 8. Now you write to the Jews as you see fit, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring may not be revoked. So look at Esther 8:9. I have an asterisk by it. I'm going to let you figure out what is special about this verse. Esther 8:9. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces, which extended from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, as well as to the Jews according to their script and their language. Whew, there's a mouthful. You know what's famous about that verse right there, Esther 8:9? It is the longest verse in the Bible. We know the shortest verse, John 11:35, Jesus wept. There's a nice trivia question. Esther 8:9, longest verse in the Bible. Verse 10, he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring and sent letters by couriers on horses, riding on steeds, sired by the royal stud. Verse 11, in them the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. On one day, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month Adar. Verse 13, a copy of the edict was to be issued as law in each and every province, was published to all the peoples, so that the Jews would be ready for this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, hastened and impelled by the king's command, went out, riding on the royal steeds, and the decree was given out at the citadel in Susa. Verse 15, this has an asterisk. This is one of the 4 verses that all read together. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. Verse 16, we all read together. For the Jews there was light and gladness and joy and honor. In each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. Okay, chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary, so that the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand before them, for the dread of them had fallen on all the peoples. So the king's edict through Haman was all the Jews would be killed on a given day, but now a new edict had been given that the people are entitled to, the Jews were entitled to fight back. And that's put fear in all the people, so there wasn't as much carnage as expected. Esther 9:3. Even all the princes of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who were doing the king's business assisted the Jews, because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. Indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai became greater and greater. Thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. We talked in the first part about the parallels or the typology, and we said that Ahasuerus might be a type of God, right? And Vashti was the Jews. Vashti was the queen who refused to come when he was called, and because she refused whenever he called, she was banished. Okay, and that kind of parallels the Jews, right? They're looking for their Messiah. When he showed up, they rejected him, and they were scattered throughout the world. All right. Who else we have in this? Mordecai. Who is Mordecai in this picture? Well, he's Jewish. And I told you his name was mentioned 58 times in the book. Esther's only 53 times. So he's a pretty prominent guy. He may be a parallel in type to the Messiah. Right? He became greater and greater. His name spread throughout all the provinces. He could be a type of Yeshua, type of the Messiah. What about Esther? Who is she in typology? Well, she's the bride of the king. That very well could be the church. I'm not hanging my hat on any of these as for sure, but there might be hints to them, okay, who they could be. But I could see Esther being the church, married to the king's new bride. Could be. Okay, now we are in 9:6. At the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And, now before I read the next 3 verses, the next 3 verses are the 10 sons of Haman. All right? And the Jews have a tradition is when they read these 10 names, that they read them all in one breath because they all died at the same time, right? As you're about to see. So, here we go. We're going to try this. Let's start with verse 6 again. At the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arasai, Aradai, and Vizatha. The 10 sons of Haman, the sons of Hamadatha, the Jews' enemy, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Whew, we did it. Okay. And by the way, we're not gloating over their death. Their fate, I think, was deserved. But anyway. So in the Tanakh, when you actually read this, you know, there are certain rules for writing in the Tanakh. You know, there's so many letters across. It's all squared. The text, okay, it's justified on both sides. But there's some exceptions to that, and this is one of them. Esther 9, 7 through 9. What you see now on your screen is what that page looks like. And if you just look carefully, look at verse 7. The first thing it says is Va'et. And then you go to the next line, Parshandatha, Va'et Dalphon, Va'et Aspartha, Va'et. That Va'et, remember Vav is and, so there's your and then they have an Aleph Tav in front of each of their names. So these are the 10 sons of Haman who do get hanged also. All right. And if you look closely, you noticed anything? Let me highlight some colors here. Ready? Bing. Right there. You see in the first one, in Parshandatha, there's a very little tav. I made it green. And then about halfway down, a little bit past, on Parmashtha, there's a very small shin in green. And the last name has a very small zayin. I put it in green. And the last name, Vizatha, has a very large vav. Wow, there are 3 minuscule and 1 majuscule letters in this list of 10 of Haman's sons. Why is that? Good question. And we may have an answer in a moment or two. Esther 9:11. And by the way, that is the only thing that's written on that page in the Tanakh. Okay, it's not mixed in with other text. It's just the list of 10 names. Very interesting. 9:11. On that day, the number of those who were killed at the citadel in Susa was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, now pay attention to this, what's happening here. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel in Susa. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall even be granted to you, and what is your further request? It shall also be done. Then said Esther, if it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do according to the edict of today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. What? Something's not right here. Listen, look at this. The king just said to Esther in verse 12, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman. So the Jews killed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman. Now, Esther, what would you like? And she says, let it be tomorrow that Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. It's like, woman, did you not hear what I just told you? 500 men have been killed and the 10 sons. And now you're asking for the 10 sons to be killed again tomorrow. Something's not right there. I got question marks. Okay, so why is that? Well, this might be a help answer. Why are those little letters in that big Vav in the list of 10 sons' names? Okay. Well, let's put in some gematria values. Here are the little letters, right? The little Tav, little Shin, little Zayin, and the giant Vav. Vav, remember, is 6. And it's a giant 6, so we're going to let that represent the 6th millennium. Okay? The first millennium went from 0 to 1,000. The second millennium went from 1,000 to 2,000. Right? The third from 2,000 to 3,000. The 6th millennium goes from 5,000 to 6,000. So we'll put a big 5 in the front for the 6th millennium. Then the small letters are a Tav, Shin, Zayin, which is 400, 307, which is 707. Which, if we put this together in a Hebrew year, the 6th millennium is 5707. That is a year on the Jewish Hebrew calendar. Okay, so what happened in 5707 Hebrew calendar? Well, the equivalent of that is on the Gregorian calendar, which we use. That's 1946. 1946 happens to be the year after World War II ended, when the Germans tried to annihilate all the Jews. No different than what Haman tried to do. And 1946 was the Nuremberg trials, right? This is where all the Nazi collaborators and soldiers and leaders were tried, and many of them hanged. Okay? Well, on October 16th, 1946, which is 21 Tishri, 5707 on the Hebrew calendar, this was the last day of Sukkot during that year, and you had this Nazi corroborator named Julius Streicher. And on that day, he was hanged. Okay, he was found guilty and hanged at from the Nuremberg trials. And this Julius Streicher, he was a bad egg. He was a newspaper guy who wrote articles over and over and over again demonizing the Jews, which stirred up the German people against the Jews, making Hitler's job easier. Okay? And part of his sentence, it said, for his 25 years of speaking, writing, and preaching hatred of the Jews, Streicher was widely known as Jew baiter number 1. In his speeches and articles, week after week, month after month, he infected the German mind with the virus of anti-Semitism and incited the German people to active persecution. Streicher's incitement to murder and extermination at the time when the Jews in the East were being killed under the most horrible conditions clearly constitutes persecution on political and racial grounds in connection with war crimes as defined by the Charter, and constitutes a crime against humanity. So this guy, he's found guilty, he's sentenced to death by hanging, and he was going to be hanged with 10 others. There were going to be 11 of them, all supposed to be hanged on the same morning. And when they went to retrieve them, one of them, Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, you know, Fatso Goering, he was the head of the Luftwaffe. Someone had slipped him, or somehow he had snuck in cyanide, and the night before he took cyanide and killed himself. So now there weren't 11 to hang, there were only 10 to hang. Interesting. So, whenever Esther is asking, he says, what else can I give you? He said, the 500 were killed here in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. What more do you want? And Esther says, if it pleases the king, let tomorrow could be 24 hours tomorrow, or tomorrow in the future, let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on a gallows. And those 10 sons could be these 10 men who were hanged on 21 Tishri 5707, which was 1946, October 16th. Those are the 10 sons of Haman who Esther is requesting be hanged. Very clever. That's a very prophetic interpretation, but I can't think of another interpretation. Why would she ask for 10 sons to be hanged again? And it just so happens that 10 sons were hanged in the future. 10 sons of Haman are very like 10 sons of Haman who were trying to kill the Jews. Verse 14. So the king commanded that it should be done so, and an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. I guess again. And the Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month Adar, and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay hands on their plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies, and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not lay hands on the plunder. Verse 17. This was done on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and the 14th of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day, and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. Therefore, the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month, Adar, a holiday for rejoicing and feasting, and sending portions of food to one another. So you have one group who's celebrating on the 14th, and the next group is celebrating on the 15th. That's important. You'll find out why in a bit. And they did 3 things here. They rejoice and feast and send portions of food to one another. So, all this feasting, we've talked about this before. In the first video, there was a whole bunch of feasts. So we're going to look at the chiastic gastroenterology of Esther. What in the world is that? Remember, a chiasm is a literary device that God uses a lot, right? One thing says, you say it the first time and you say it backwards, okay? Man was not made for the Sabbath was made for man. They're just the reverse of each other, okay? And you can make a longer chiasm. And here we have one. If you sit down and write down all the banquets that's happening in Esther, they form a chiasm, okay? First of all, we had Xerxes. He had a 180-day feast throughout the empire. And then as soon as it was over, this is like a, little a, he had a 7-day feast, okay? And the second B, we have, there was a feast in celebration of Esther's ascension. When Vashti was banned, Esther became queen, and in Esther 2:18, it talks about Esther's feast. Then you had Esther invited the king and Haman to a banquet. And when they came to a banquet, she invited them to a banquet the next day. So there's a repeat of that, okay, in Esther 7:1-9. Then, whenever the Jews' destruction was reversed, there was a feast in celebration of the reversal in Esther 8:17. Then, whenever the whole battle was over and the Jews had conquered all their enemies, killed the 75,000 and the 10 sons of Haman, okay, and this is the one we just read in 9:17. It says the Feast of Purim for the Jews throughout the empire, okay, and we told you that some of them celebrated on the 14th, and there was a Feast of Purim for the Jews in Susa, mentioned in 9:18, on the 15th. So notice how everything lines up, right? Every feast, at the beginning there was a feast at the end. There was a minor feast at the beginning and a minor feast at the end. Everything is in a chiastic order. Very clever. It's letting you know that there is order in this book, and God is a God of order. Okay, 9:20. Then Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to celebrate the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of the same month annually. Because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which was turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and rejoicing, and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So this is a 2-day feast holiday that the Jews celebrate. It's usually in February or March. Now the Jews, it's almost as if it's the Jews' version of Halloween. Originally, the kids would dress up as different characters, right? A little girl could dress up like Queen Esther. You had King Ahasuerus, and as they come and go on the stage, the people cheer or rant or boo when Haman comes out, and they make noise with the little noisemakers, or they boo and try to drown him out. Okay, and now I've actually been to Israel during Purim, and just driving through the streets, there were people dressed like Superman and Cinderella and all kind of crazy outfits, and it just turned into a big street party, like a Halloween party, and everybody's in costume. So it had nothing really to do religious significance, but in the synagogues, when they do act this out, the kids usually dress up like the different characters, and they get booed and cheered accordingly. So it is something that is happening even through today. And in this Purim, remember Purim, there are certain requirements that have to be done in Purim. And why again do we call it Purim? Pur, remember, is, oh, by the way, look here what we have today. We have a glass. Can you read this? Pur. Today, by the way, we're drinking peach nectar. It's kind of like orange phlegm. All right, sorry. A pur is like a die, and if you pluralize it, it's purim, dice, okay? And this is what Haman, he cast lots, he threw dice to figure out what day in the future that they would kill all the Jews. And so today the Jews read Purim every year to celebrate this holiday when the Jews were saved by Mordecai and Esther. And the Megillah is read from a scroll. Remember, the word Megillah is scroll, okay? So they do read it from a scroll, and it is read while standing. So everything that we read so far would all be read while standing. And it is read twice. It's read in the evening before Purim begins, and it's read again the next morning. And there are 3 things that should be done on Purim, 3 mitzvahs. A mitzvah is the good deed, okay? You are to enjoy a feast. You are to send food and gifts to others. And you are to distribute gifts to the poor. Where do we get those 3 rules right there? You get it from verse 9:22. because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which was turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make themselves days of feasting and rejoicing, and sending portions of food to one another, and gifts to the poor. I had a Jewish friend I used to go visit in Houston, and he wasn't the richest man. He was actually on the poor side, and we were visiting, and it was Purim, and I didn't realize this, but an ultra-Orthodox Jewish friend of his showed up, and he came in with plates of food for my friend, and he was doing what the instruction says, sending portions of food to one another. Okay? So I've actually seen Jews doing this. Very nice. Okay? 9:23. Thus the Jews undertook what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, the lot, to disturb them and destroy them. But when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by letter that his wicked scheme, which he had advised against the Jews, should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they call these days Purim, after the name Pur. And because of the instructions in this letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what had happened to them, the Jews established and made a custom for themselves and for their descendants and for all those who allied themselves with them, so that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days according to their regulation and according to their appointed time annually. So it is a tradition that's continuing to today. They still celebrate it on these 2 days. Esther 9:28. So these days are to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim were not to fail from among the Jews, or their memory fade from their descendants. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. He sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, namely words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and for their descendants with instructions for their times of fasting and their lamentations. The command of Esther established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book. Okay, I'm telling you about this holiday that they celebrate every year called Purim, right? The plural, Purim. But I want you to point out that this is not a moed. You understand the difference between just a regular holiday and a moed. The moedim, plural for moed, are established back in Genesis 1:14. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for moedim and for days and years." Moedim are these appointed times of Yahweh, or holy convocations of the Lord. There are 7 of them. We see all 7 of them mentioned in Leviticus 23. 3 of them are in the spring: Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits. And then late spring, early summer, you have Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks. And then in the fall, you have Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpet, the Moed of trumpet blowing, okay, which we now call Rosh Hashanah, or a lot of Jews do. We have the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and we have Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. Those are the 3 fall feasts. And these are all very prophetic, okay? The spring feasts, Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits represent the crucifixion, burial, and the resurrection of Yeshua. The late spring, Shavuot, this was the giving of the Torah originally. In the New Testament, the very same day, it was the giving of the Holy Spirit. Came on Shavuot, which we Christians call Pentecost. It was 50 days after Passover. And in the fall, you have, again, Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. Which those are also going to be prophetically fulfilled, and I'll tell you about that in a second. Esther 9:32, the command of Esther established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book. So Purim is one of these holidays that's not a moed. And there's another one that's really big that we all have heard of, and that is Hanukkah. Okay? Hanukkah is not one of the 7 moedim. Okay? And we see Hanukkah mentioned back in the book of Numbers, Bamidbar 7:10. And the leaders offered the dedication offering for the altar when it was anointed. So the leaders offered their offering before the altar. Hanukkah means dedication. Okay? And Yeshua Jesus himself celebrated Hanukkah. In John 10:22, it says, at that time, the Feast of Dedication took place in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple courts in Solomon's colonnade. So we have Jesus himself celebrating Hanukkah. All right? But just know that Purim and Hanukkah are not Moedim. All right? The Moedim, by the way, we've told you, these are the 7 here, right? Passover represents the death of Yeshua. Unleavened bread is his burial. First fruits is the resurrection. Shavuot is Pentecost, the giving of the Spirit. And then you have Yom Teruah, which is trumpets. Yom Kippur, atonement. Sukkot, tabernacles. The first 4 have been fulfilled with Yeshua's death, burial, resurrection, and the giving of the Holy Spirit. The last 3 have not been fulfilled yet, but they're coming. Yom Teruah, I believe, is the day the rapture will take place. The day of trumpet blasts, right? When you hear about the rapture, it's the archangel will shout and the trumpet of God will sound and the dead in Christ rise first. It's a day of trumpet blasts. Yom Kippur, I believe, is the second coming, when he separates the good from the bad, those who are believers and who are remaining after the tribulation, and those who aren't. Some are going to be just cast into hell. And then you have Sukkot, that represents the millennial reign, the 1,000-year reign of peace, where Messiah will rule and reign from Jerusalem. So those are the Moedim that God wants us to keep. Purim and Hanukkah are just kind of national days of Israel. All right? The Moedim speak of what God does. The national days of Israel speak of what men did. There's a difference. All right? And just know that they are not Moedim. Okay? So it's either Purim represents lots, Hanukkah is dedication. And speaking of lots, whenever you think of lots, you think of dice, right? And casting lots. And dice are probably the epitome of a symbol of chance. Okay? But if you remember, I've told you this in other videos, there is no biblical Hebrew word for coincidence. God didn't need such a word. And if you look at the entire story of Esther, you know, what are the chances that Vashti would refuse to come to the king? And what are the chances that the king would depose Vashti? And then he looks for another queen, and a young Jewish girl ascends the Persian throne. The chances of these happening are pretty slim. And then what about Mordecai? He happens to overhear an assassination plot, and he reports it to the queen, who then tells the king. And then that his reporting of this is recorded, But the king doesn't know about it, and he doesn't reward Mordecai at that time. And then there's the whole, why is he promoted? He's such an arrogant no-goodnik, yet why did the king promote him? And then there was the whole random chance of Haman casting lots for the day to kill the Jews. And then there's the confrontation between Mordecai and Esther, where she says, I can't go into the king, because if I go and I'm not called, I will be killed. But he gives her encouragement and says, maybe you were put here for such a time as this. And then there's the whole uncertainty whether the king would receive her when she does go in. And then the king can't sleep one night, and he has, of all things, read to him. They pick of any book of the Chronicles, they happen to read the story of Mordecai overhearing the assassination plot. And then there's the whole Haman's plot gets reversed. There's no Hebrew word for coincidence, and God is not mentioned in Esther, but I think God is in Esther. He's working under the radar here, okay? So it turns out this symbol of chance, lots, is actually maybe a symbol of anti-chance, because God has his fingers working in every detail to make it all work out. All things work for good for those who love the Lord and work according to his purpose. Chapter 10. This is the last one here. 10:1. Now King Ahasuerus laid a tribute on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the accomplishments of his authority and strength, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Verse 3, it's an asterisk. This is the one we all read together. For Mordecai, the Jew, was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. All right. Well, that concludes the book of Esther. Thank you so much for watching. What a story, huh? Just great. All right. To God be the honor. To God be the glory. To God be the praise. And we will see you soon. Bye-bye. Wait. We have a bonus. Okay. I told you when they read the Megillah that they stand while reading it. So we're going to read it right now, and I'm going to stand and read it. And we're going to read from the JKV, the John Caustic version. Xerxes told his clerks he's going to throw a banquet ball. To display wealth of his kingdom, all his gardens, jewels ring them, and to all the people bring them food and wine for one and all. Vashti, acting rashly, ignored husband Xerxes' call. Since she did not give a reason, Xerxes thinks it act of treason. Wise men tell the king that she's on thin ice, time for her downfall. Young girls, search among worlds that I own for my new queen. Xerxes says he wants to choose a new queen, so girls come to Susa. In my harem I will use a eunuch who will make them clean. Esther is the best for Xerxes, who says, I choose you. Mordecai, who's Esther's cousin, tells her maybe, since she wasn't, king's religion, that she mustn't tell the king that she's a Jew. Gatemen, one night late when no one's round, plot king must die. Mordecai, who's sitting near them, accidentally overhears them, tells the Queen Esther, who then steers them to the king, who hangs them high. Haman, to whom king came and honored with royal decree.
All the citizens must bow to Haman, but no way, no how, today or past are Jews allowed to, so Mordecai would not bend knee. Jealous, jealous, hate as well as spite makes Haman seethe for sure. He tells King it's very urgent that we kill each Jew insurgent, and to pick a date to purge went out and cast a lot, or pur. Warning, warning, Jews start mourning when they hear of coming fate. And to mourn, as was the fashion, Mordecai put sackcloth sash on, sat and wailed in pile of ash on other side of city gate. Fasting, fasting, 3 days lasting, Jews conform to Esther's wish. Before Xerxes she proceeds to go and tell him that she needs to ask a favor, and she pleads to him in hopes she won't perish. Xerxes, Xerxes, says the perk she's worthy of is half his all. She tells King she won't now say more, but if he will wait 1 day more, she'll prepare a nice buffet for him and Haman when they call. Haman, still the same and feeling good with hand he's dealt. Walking home he see Jew hoof sits, still unbending, sets off new fits. This Jew will hang 50 cubits, so he has a gallows built. Xerxes, Xerxes, jumps and jerks, he's wide awake, can't get shut eye. He leafs through a history book then, and sees risk that one man took when gate men turned out to be crook men, thinks to honor Mordecai. Haman, called by name, and comes with hanging news for king. Xerxes asks if Haman's knowing of best way of honor showing. Haman's answer keeps on going, thinking he's to get each thing. Xerxes, Xerxes sets in works these things that Haman said to do. When Haman learns that Mordecai get all these things, he's mortified yet. The honor that the court applied set Haman's grief and his wife's too. Esther, Esther, the king requests her, what can I do for my queen? She entreats, if I've found favor with you, all my people save, for were they sent to early graves, your wife, a Jew, will not be seen. Xerxes, Xerxes, goes berserk, sees he must find who'd do such thing. Esther points to Haman vile, king storms out to garden while Haman pleads for fair man's trial. Hang him high, declares the king. Esther, Esther, you can rest your worried mind, proclaims Xerxes. The evil plan toward Jews I'll stay, and give to you the wealth of Haman. For Mordecai new royal raiment, and Haman's sons I'll hang all these. Purim, Purim, now a forum day, recalling the Jews' plight. Jews observe this day because Lot turned the tables of what was plot to kill the Jews, and Esther was not scared to speak for what was right.
Okay, there's your bonus. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. Wait! We have another bonus. Okay, you're going to love this one. You know, as we read through this, there's a lot of things that are happening twice. And you may not have noticed them, but I'm going to point them out to you because there's a lot of seeing double in the book of Esther. Look in Esther 1:10. It says, on the seventh day the king's heart was merry with wine, and he ordered 7 eunuchs who served him. And then you go down to Esther 1:14. It says his closest advisors were, and then it lists 7 advisors. So there's 2 lists of 7 servants. Okay, I see that. In Esther 2:10, it says Esther did not reveal her people or her lineage because Mordecai had instructed her not to do so. And in 2:14, it said Esther still had not revealed her lineage or her people, just as Mordecai had instructed. So we have twice mentioned that she did not reveal her Jewish identity. In Esther 2:8, the king's command and edict had been proclaimed, and many young women were gathered at the citadel of Susa under the care of Haggai. And in Esther 2:19, it says, when the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. So twice it's mentioned that the virgins were gathered. Esther 3:10, the king removed his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, the Agagite, enemy of the Jews. And in Esther 8:2, and the king removed the signet ring he had recovered from Haman and presented it to Mordecai. So twice the king removes and gives his signet ring. Esther 5:2, as soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he found favor in his sight. The king extended the gold scepter in his hand toward Esther. And later in Esther 8:3 and 4, once again, Esther addressed the king. She fell at his feet weeping and begged him to revoke the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter toward Esther, and she arose and stood before the king. Twice the king extends golden scepter. Esther 6:12. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. And then later in Esther 8:3 and 4, just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, would he actually assault the queen while I am in the palace? As soon as the words had left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So twice it's mentioned that Haman's head is covered. Look at this one, Esther 3:12 and Esther 8:10. Look at this. On the 13th day of the first month, the royal scribes were summoned, and the order was written. Okay, Mordecai wrote in 8:10. The order was written in the name of King Xerxes. Happened at the beginning, happened at the end. And it was sealed with the royal signet ring. He sent documents by mounted couriers. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued in every province and published to all the people, so that they would be ready on that day. I mean, it's like a mirror. They're reading it twice. Beautiful. In Esther 5:4, Esther says, if it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to a banquet. And when they came to the banquet, Esther says in verse 7, my petition request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and do what I request, may the king and Haman come to a banquet. All through this book, there are things happening twice. Maybe the first time it happens, it's like the die is cast, but then it happens again and it gets reversed. Very nice. Okay. All right. Well, that's it. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.